As you listen, keep in mind that though this podcast features medical and other professionals and regularly speaks on the topic of psychoactive substances in a positive light, nothing heard here should ever be taken as medical advice or as encouragement to consume any of the substances mentioned, especially the ones that are blatantly illegal in your country of residence. Listen critically and always check in with yourself before acting based on anything you hear or read on the internet.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to yet another episode of ATTMind Radio. I am your host, as always, James W. Jesso, and I am excited to bring you more episodes on my consistent dedication and commitment to bringing you high-quality content over and over again. So throughout this episode, you might notice some audio glitches or some video glitches due to bandwidth. Just hold some space for it. It's going to unfold quite nicely in the long run. And before to start the show, I am really happy to announce that I have received 2 5-star reviews on iTunes, and I'm going to send a thank you to Travels Too Much, who said, "Nice work on this podcast. There's a lot of information here that needs to get out." And then he made a really great point about ibogaine cardiotoxicity in regards to episode 3 with Jonathan Dickinson. So for the people who are interested in ibogaine and working with that medicine or just more information about it, that's a cool comment and it's a cool episode. The other one is from C. Honeybee, who said, such an abyss of rich, relevant, and valuable concepts and knowledge, perfectly diverse content, yet all relatable and in a cohesive, unified direction. Thank you. I'm really glad that it's getting received in a positive way. If you guys like it, other people here, you listeners, please feel free to leave some reviews on iTunes. Now, jumping into our interview today with Dr. Devon Christie. So I'm going to read off her bio. It's really intense. This woman has done a lot of awesome stuff. Dr. Devon Christie MD completed her honors Bachelor of Health Science and Doctorate of Medicine degrees at McMaster University and postgraduate residency in Rural Family Medicine through UBC. Dr. Christie has also obtained U.S. certification in Integrative and Functional Medicine, and her Vancouver practice at Connect Health Center for Integrative Medicine, reflects this focus. She is also a yoga instructor, and in 2012, she obtained certification through the World Shamanic Yoga Institute in a 4-week residential training in Cusco, Peru. Dr. Christie is a qualified mindfulness-based stress reduction facilitator through UC San Diego Mindfulness-Based Professional Training Institute, and in May of this year, she obtained certification through UMass Center for Mindfulness to teach the interpersonal mindfulness program. In 2014, Devon collaborated with Dr. Gabor Mate to bring healers together for a 10-day retreat with sacred Amazonian plant medicine, exploring the wounded healer archetype, and is returning once again this December to co-facilitate further retreats with Gabor. Devon recently completed a 9-month study program this November in somatic therapy, which is body-focused psychotherapy, which you guys would be familiar with if you have been following the podcast thus far, which she will weave into her mindfulness group facilitation in order to better serve the high percentage of individuals who have suffered traumas in their childhood and adult years. She has been a longtime advisory board member to MAPS Canada and has been involved in the current Vancouver Phase 2 study investigating MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for refractory post-traumatic stress disorder. Welcome, Dr. Devon.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
There was just before this interview started, you had mentioned that there was another piece there to that to your bio.
Sure. Yeah. Recently, this past year, I was appointed clinical instructor through the University of British Columbia Department of Family Practice to teach mindfulness-based stress reduction to family medicine residents in their first year of residency training here in the Kootenays in Nelson, BC.
Oh, that's cool. I love the Kootenays so much. So what a nice reason to be out there. Now, before this interview goes on, I understand that as a professional doctor working with a specific, a very well-established practice, that there are certain things that you are, just generally not associated to. And myself, I understand that as someone who speaks very openly about psychedelics, it's commonly misunderstood or accidentally implied by people talking to me that I might facilitate mushroom experiences or something. So, which is not the case. So if throughout the course of the conversation, my language or questions accidentally implies anything that it shouldn't, just please correct me, because I don't know how to navigate that. I don't know how to navigate that language, and I don't want to accidentally create the allure of something that isn't actually real.
For sure. Yeah. Thanks, James. I appreciate that. I'm certainly fascinated by the field, and there is a ton of emergent literature, a lot of pilot data, and really promising studies through organizations like MAPS, other institutions like Johns Hopkins that are looking at these substances very seriously. It's really a reemergence of research into psychedelics that's looking like it is going to be a new paradigm as far as how we treat mental health disorders specifically. So that's really exciting. And even just this past October, there was a review article in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, which is the journal distributed to every physician in Canada, regardless of specialty, that reviewed psychedelic substances and the current state of research. So that was really exciting to see that this is being put out to all of my colleagues in a positive light.
Mm-hmm. From what I understand about the history of the social atmosphere around psychedelics and academia, is that they've had a pretty bad rap for a little while.
Yeah, it was a rocky road, and really back in the 70s, there was some fabulous research being started with some really promising results, but there were also some applications of research that were not so safe with respect to the subjects involved. Look at strapping people into a room and giving them LSD, that type of thing, where we know in the field that really the set and setting is primary to the outcome. So there was some harms done, and there was also a lot of alarmist claims. There was certain people in the field who were making wild statements that were, alarming to the public, and also taken by policy leaders and politicians, and spun. And it generally created a huge atmosphere of fear around these substances and the research being done. So it was shut down quite dramatically. And it's really only been in the last few years that we're starting to see a reemergence and a reinvestigation of the potential promising features of these substances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very exciting for me. I remember when I was just going through my own personal journey of discovering my relationship with mushrooms in a conscious way, and then going through the journey of addressing some detrimental behavioral patterns, conscious and otherwise. And I could see things changing. This was around 2010-ish, 2011 that I started, and I got the sense that there was a wave coming, and it was about to crest in the mainstream, and it's really nice to see it going over in a positive way.
Yeah, 2014 has been a huge year. There was a fabulous article in the New Yorker this past year. I can't remember the name of it right now, but a fabulous review of a lot of the work being done out of Johns Hopkins with psilocybin particularly, as well as a great review of what happened in the history of the research being done and why it was shut down. So I would really I would definitely direct your readers to the New Yorker. I wish I could remember the issue, but it came out, I think, sometime in the summer of 2014.
Yeah, it shouldn't be no problem for me to source that and throw it into the show notes. Now, the reason that I have you on here is definitely not to talk about the history of psychedelics and the current, cultural atmosphere around it in the emerging medicine field for it at this time, but it's actually because of the presentation you gave at the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference back in October. Now, for the listeners, a little background is that I attended this fundraising dinner afterwards, and Devon and I ended up sitting next to each other and just chatting for a little while. And there was this deep resonance that I felt with her work. I felt as though it was right on the exact tip of something that I was working with in myself throughout the course of the summer, giving a different talk called The Purge, Entheogens in the Limbic System. But it was very clear that what she had going for her was at a much higher level of complexity in language. And then when I saw your talk, Devon, I was just fully blown away. And so I wanted to get into that. Now, I can't exactly remember the name of your talk at the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference. Can you remind me?
Sure, yeah. It was called 3 Pillars of Support for Deep Healing with Spirit Plant Medicines. And the 3 pillars were mindfulness, a trauma-informed approach, and intense deep group process integration. So Those were the 3 pillars, yeah.
Can you go into first exactly what your, the workshop offered this, or the lecture offered this sense that there's this larger understanding about how to not only catalyze and generate experiences within the psychedelics, within the psychedelic context that can be healing, but that seemingly the most important approach is how they're integrated later. Can you, give a rundown of what it is that this approach intends to offer people in their experiences and integrating their experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I want to say that I believe that these 3 pillars that I've identified are the hold true for any type of healing endeavor, whether we're talking about working with any type of psychoactive substance, psychedelic, or if we're just talking about anybody's healing journey in their life. How it applies to work with plant medicine, spirit plant medicine, psychedelics in a broad framework is I think it contributes a lot to our understanding of the set and setting, which are terms that were coined that really apply to the mindset that a person brings to an experience, as well as the setting or the container in which the experience takes place. So mindfulness is a huge component, in my view, to the mindset that an individual brings to an experience. And we can certainly go into detail on that and what points support that. Trauma-informed approach, I believe, is really important when we're looking at the predominant, Western psychological background and the influences of our culture over the last several centuries. Really, individualist society. We're under capitalism, materialism, a lot of self-sufficiency, idealism, and nuclear families, I think fragmentation of communities. And so this context, we really need to understand trauma because what we're learning in the field of trauma is that the incidence or the rates of trauma that are very relevant over the trajectory of an individual's life in terms of their health, their happiness, mental health, physical health, are quite dramatically high. And I would specify trauma-related suffering is dramatically high in our culture. And I think a lot of that owes to difficulties with early childhood attachment and developmental trauma issues. And we can talk more about that as well. But it's almost ubiquitous. In the presentation I gave, I asked people to put their hands up in the audience if they experienced a parent, a mother or father who suffered from any type of mental health disorder like depression or anxiety or identified personality disorder traits, or if they experienced a rearing environment in their childhood where their parent, one or more of their parents, abused alcohol or other substances. If they come from a family history or lineage where there was trauma in the parents' lives before they were born, or trauma in the ancestors' ancestral line, we're starting to understand how trauma can propagate across generations, specifically through epigenetic imprinting across generations. And we've seen that in studies that have been done post 9/11, for example, and also with Holocaust survivals. So there's this ancestral piece that's also relevant in terms of things like cortisol receptor density in the developing baby, which then starts to affect how they respond to stress in their lives, how their physiology is wired up. So it's a bit of a long-winded explanation, but suffice to say that trauma is very prevalent, and we need to be looking through this lens to understand what's emerging in the experiences of individuals when they're specifically interacting with these potent substances that are unearthing fragments of memories, etc., which we can go into in more detail. And then the final pillar, which is this group process integration work, I also feel is really an essential piece in the setting. So there's the setting of the experience itself, and then there's also everything around that setting. And I definitely would advocate for 100% across the board for there to be some type of intentional integration process with somebody or a number of people who are skilled in facilitation of this type of thing, who have a fluency or a background in Western psychotherapeutic approaches, so that we can understand what's emerging for people within our lens, our cultural framework, and help people to then integrate those experiences together in a circle, which also adds so much to it. When we have a group of people gathered together in a state of presence, this not only amplifies the possibility for the individual to experience a state of presence, which really all healing happens in the present moment. And this is informed from my background in trauma resolution. So it allows for this really resonant and coherent field of presence in which people are sharing their experiences. So there's a circle of compassion that can hold people in their vulnerability. We can let down the masks of repression of our authentic experience that happen in our lives, that began in our childhoods. So there's all of this healing that happens in the group specifically that is so fruitful that I really think it shouldn't be left out. And also I think people can walk away from experiences possibly harmed if they haven't had an opportunity to integrate it fully and understand and kind of have an inroads to understanding the meaning of their experience, especially if it was very abstract or dark. So those are the three pillars, and really applying a lot to the set and setting.
Cool. I want to go with more depth into each of those pillars, and also, I guess, echo back how important I think it is to have a fuller understanding of the meaning behind our experiences, which informs this podcast, so the reasoning behind the podcast and the things that I write and the work that I do is to give people a functional substrate or a functional platform to house their experiences so that it doesn't cause more fragmentation in themselves to have these weird novel experiences, which might be really blissful, but might also be extremely traumatic. And again, I want to get into each of those pillars. And I also want to echo out this idea about epigenetic trauma, generational trauma. This was something that came to me in my work with medicines, and then also in my study, and have taught about in the past over the last couple of years through lecture I gave called Conscious Relationships and Psychospiritual Maturity, and through other talks I've given about psilocybin mushrooms, around the idea that there is obvious genetic disposition that gets passed on. And then we're coming to understand that there's also this epigenetic disposition, which is to say that the manner in which your genetics express themselves in regards to your cellular behavior. And in my model, even beyond the cellular behavior, because cells are a piece of a larger integrative whole organism that includes psychological and emotional behaviors. So these changes inside of your life create changes in your cellular memory, which will then play an influence into how the physiology and the psychology of generations to come will influence. And so I like to think that each person is like the converging point of their entire lineage on their mother and their father's side come together, and all the medicine that they've learned, and then also all the trauma in some way or another will be endowed into the physiology of that child, and then potentiated over time, the medicines or the trauma given that those childhood experiences. And recently I was having a conversation with a tantric practitioner friend of mine, and we were talking about this, and she brought in the 7 generations concept from some of the more, I'm not sure what indigenous tradition, but that, they say, think about what you do, it'll affect 7 generations to come. But then also that means 7 generations past is affecting you. And that this is, a turn of phrase, but it also can be a literal truth, which eventually we'll come to see scientifically or come to refine scientifically when we develop the capacity to measure it with the tools that justify what we call as scientific evidence. Now, before we go into the first pillar, which is mindfulness, it's obvious already that trauma is going to come up a lot. And that, I guess that's like a larger statement than I intended it to be, but trauma is going to come up in this conversation a lot. And I was wondering, can you please give us a description of what is trauma? Because I think for a lot of people, first thing that's going to come up into their head might be, like a car accident or something really extreme that happened as a child, like your parent dies or there's a severe accident or severe sickness and stuff. And trauma includes that, but it isn't only these extreme experiences, is it?
Absolutely. You're very right. When people think of trauma, they think of what we would classify as a shock trauma. So a big event that happens, witnessing a murder or car accident or being a victim of assault, these types of things. And these are indeed traumas. The overarching definition of trauma is a trauma occurs when a person is overwhelmed by events or enduring circumstances, and they experience intense fear and helplessness, and their capacity to adapt is overridden. So we all have this inborn capacity to meet the stressors in our environment, to be flexible, to respond, to survive. And when a trauma occurs, those capacities are just overwhelmed. And it's also been thought of as something that is too much, too fast, too soon. So that's a really simple way of thinking about trauma. And Peter Levine, who's a fabulous luminary in this field of understanding trauma, he wrote the book, Waking the Tiger. And he describes that trauma is held in the nervous system and not in the event. So when we think of trauma, let's not think of the event that happened, but let's think of how this event was actually imprinted on the nervous system, on the biology of the individual when those adaptive responses were overwhelmed. And the piece I also want to add to that is in our early years, human beings are incredibly dependent, incredibly sensitive organisms. I'm talking infancy, early childhood, and so much that happens in our environment is actually really relevant to our survival. So we're dependent on our parents for our survival. We're the most dependent species, I think, on the face of the planet. So these survival needs, to be fed, to be clothed, to be sheltered, play into the importance of our attachment with our caregivers. So that's why this whole piece of developmental and attachment trauma can be so significant in our biology, because as little ones, we don't even have the capacity to self-regulate our own autonomic nervous system when we're born. We actually are born with only a sympathetic nervous system capacity. The parasympathetic is not yet online. So we actually need our mother or a primary caregiver to regulate our nervous systems for us. So when we're upset and we're crying and we need something to be soothed and co-regulated. So when those pieces are absent, it's actually quite a significant imprint that's left on the nervous system and in these implicit memory systems that we can talk about. So trauma is too much, too fast, too soon, and overwhelming the organism's natural inborn capacities to adapt.
Cool. I wanna just deepen into this what you were just saying about the trauma is not the event, but it's how the event is imprinted into your nervous system, which is to say that the thoughts, the ideas that we might have about an event, and trying to deal with the thoughts that come up from an event that might be based in a trauma are not actually based in these thoughts. These thoughts are almost like an epiphenomenon of an emotional experience, something that's logged directly into our, like you said, into the nervous system. And I think this comes really important in the psychedelic experience, because a lot of people will use psychedelics or visionary plants, etc., with a very visionary aspect in mind. They're going in for the visions and going in for this and that, and then they come out and they have these great stories, but they weren't being mindful of what was coming up here, like in the nervous system, and utilizing this as an opportunity to realign the nervous system into more functional pathways. Now, I didn't mean to go off on a psychedelic tangent there, but that's just, I guess, what I do. What I really wanted to deepen into was this idea about the child, the infant. Now, we're talking, what age are we talking when you say a child, their nervous system is sympathetic only?
That's very early infancy. So the newborn, up to even a year, up to 18 months, that nervous system is developing and coming online, much parallel to how our immune system is fresh and develops and comes online as we get older.
Mm-hmm. And so the infant and even the small child has this need for security just as much as the rest of us, for survival. And I am feeling a resonance here in regards to Neil Goldsmith's work regarding psychospiritual maturation and the way we develop it has to do with the little traumas that are endowed in a child prior to being able to have explicit memory, when their natural behavior is responded to by their parents with a hot, anger, or cool reduction of love response, which a child's number one priority is love from their parental ecology. And if they're not getting that, not having love means, like you said, not being fed, not being sheltered, not being protected.
It means... Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'd like to hear what you have to say. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's a life and death situation for the infant. And as you say, that explicit memory capacity doesn't even begin to come online until 18 months. So what we get is, you've mentioned in our conversations, limbic imprinting. I refer to it as implicit imprinting. But the world of the newborn, the young child, is very much a world of emotional and felt experience, which is all in the implicit. So a life and death situation or a threatening situation is eliciting fear and getting imprinted quite dramatically into the nervous system and into the subconscious. Children also are in predominantly a theta brainwave state up until almost age 7. So we're really emotional beings all throughout our childhood. So these emotional experiences and what's happening in our environment is pretty much getting downloaded into our subconscious all the way through. It sort of bridges into this discussion about what is the nature of implicit versus explicit memory, which I think is really important to understand when we're talking about trauma resolution, and as well as you're referring to what happens in a psychedelic experience, especially when people are expecting like maybe the visionary element, but not prepared for the full body implicit experience that arises. So explicit memory is what we think of as memory when we think of it generally, right? I was born in Ontario and I grew up and this event happened, and it's on a linear time frame. It has a narrative. We can go back and recall events and speak about them on a timeline. Now, implicit memory, which is also called procedural memory in neuroscience, is a very different thing. Implicit memory is held in fragments, and it is held sometimes when we're talking about trauma in encapsulated fragments. So they're under the surface of our awareness, and they've been walled off for good reason. Implicit memory is body-based memory. It's a felt experience. So when an implicit imprint is recalled, it actually feels like it's happening now. So implicit memory has been called the ever-present past, because when it's triggered, it actually feels like it's happening now. And often people will feel bewildered because they don't know why they're having this emotional experience. And then they'll often look to the circumstances of their external environment to explain it, blaming others or the circumstances around them, when really the circumstances are triggering something that was held in the implicit memory system for a really long time, possibly since early childhood, even infancy. Mm-hmm. So that distinction is really important. And as you say, with psychedelics, I think that's part of the real promise of psychedelics. Especially, I'm more familiar with ayahuasca specifically, in its ability to take certain functional neural circuits offline. Like, for example, this default mode network, which is very much activated when we're engaging in our sense of our narrative self in the world, to kind of take that offline, which then allows more implicit material to surface to conscious awareness. So we can get a lot of insight, and we can be consciously privy to some of this material stored in the implicit memory system that we were otherwise walling off or keeping at bay in our everyday experience. So it brings up the material. And at the same time, it also, I believe, helps us to access our natural inborn healing capacity and resources at the same time, to look at that and to deal with that. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll pause there.
Yeah. And in the past, like when I was really just butting into the discussion about utilizing psychedelics, some of the crew that I was hanging out with, and because obviously it resonated with me as well, we often used a lot of computer technology metaphors to describe the experiences we were going through. And one of the terms we would use to talk about using psilocybin mushrooms was like running a defrag on the system. And mm-hmm. to me, this really connects in with what you're saying, because all these implicit memories, these implicit imprints, are logged in various places that aren't consolidated with each other. And then depending on, whatever model you may or may not work with to see how they affect or gather in the mind, they get charged up through different occurrences throughout the course of your life. And then I lean into Stanislav Grof's model for coex systems of condensed experiences, where all of these seemingly fragmented experiences that all contain the same emotional theme and thus similar psychological mechanisms employed to protect from the trauma of that theme begin to develop a cumulative charge. And then each time it's triggered again, it seems like a completely unrelated event, but it's actually the same emotional theme triggered again, where that charge comes up to more or less degrees. And that when you're in a psychedelic experience, you have them come up, the default mode network is shut down, the typical story isn't there. In fact, a really atypical story comes in, which is, I think, where all these visionary aspects and metaphorical thought come through, is that it's your mind now still trying to produce some sort of story, but it's all metaphorical. And I think if we get too attached to the visions, then we miss out on the real healing, which is that we, like Grof says, activate alignment with the cumulative emotional charge of whatever coex system it might be. So whatever trauma imprints are in the nervous system that come forth into the fullness of our body in that moment. And that in the fullness of this body, we get an opportunity to what in a lot of the ayahuasca or Amazonian related traditions will say is a purge, which is that, I see the purge as crying, sweating, even just feeling anxiety, feeling your normal thought patterns amplified to like 100,000 times how strong they are, whether it be self-resistance or inadequacy or hopelessness or what have you. But then there's also the vomiting element in ayahuasca. And the defrag aspect for me comes when all of this stuff, it's like it's coming into the surface. And as an adult, you're creating an explicit memory that aligns with the implicit process of taking these fragmented expressions of emotion, consolidating them into one large release that is directly associated with something in the physical body, the sweating, the crying, the vomiting, the shaking, the hot, or the diarrhea maybe, whatever it is. And you build in your limbic system, you create a continuity that says, I've released this. It's like, oh, I've gotten it out. Like, oh, it's processed. And then comes the integration piece later. Yeah. Do you know of Groff's model? Does that work in your perspective?
Certainly, yeah. It links with a number of things I've looked at and studied in trauma resolution work. Another model that Peter Levine uses is, he talks about how implicit experiences can be overcoupled or undercoupled. So an overcoupling is when certain elements of experience get fused together, or undercoupling is when elements of implicit fragments are abnormally dissociated from one another. So what the resolution process does is it brings integration into the system, creating space between elements that are overcoupled and creating connection between elements that are undercoupled. And, I really wanted to mention in listening to what you were saying there, is when an implicit imprint is up, like if to use the computer metaphor, like when you open the program, and the program's running, so you got the implicit memory up, it's visceral, it's present moment, it feels like it's happening right now because it is physiologically in the body. That's when that program, that implicit imprint, is actually, it's malleable and it's available to new information. So in the healing work, in trauma resolution work, in somatic therapy, what we're doing is we're opening these programs so that they're alive, viscerally felt in the present moment. And then we're taking our resources, which is we've got tons of time, we've got a safe environment with a healthy, positive person that is trusted, and we're giving new information to this implicit memory. So and the interesting thing about the implicit is that it doesn't tell the difference between what's real or what is real imagined. Mm-hmm. So, like in a somatic therapy session, I had an unfortunate near drowning accident and then was put back in this raft and sent down three more sets of rapids after I nearly died. And in resolving that trauma, what I did was I opened up the implicit imprint and I was feeling what I felt at that time. And then with the therapist and the helper, I imagined getting into this van that was nice and warm, that was on the road that paralleled the river, and bumping down the road. I had somebody right next to me, so I had physical contact of their shoulder against my shoulder. They're with me in the van, and we're going down the road and really elaborating that experience. And then what that does is that puts new information into the implicit imprint and reconsolidates it. So that now when I recall that event, there's no longer any charge. As far as my implicit memory is concerned, I got in the van and went down the road, so this is what's happening in the trauma resolution work. And as you say, for example, in a psychedelic experience, these imprints come up and, we have this, where I think we're facilitated in moving charge through the system. So moving the energy where it's held physiologically out, sequencing it out. That's another principle of trauma resolution, is sequencing trauma energy out of the system so that it can be released and no longer stored. And that's a very visceral process, often through shaking, yawning, coughing, feeling nauseous. These are things that happen when people are doing somatic therapy without any type of substance on board. So we can see the overlap with a substance like ayahuasca, which is encouraging these physical purges and movement of energy, and at the same time bringing up the implicit and making it open to new information. And as you say, this conscious awareness that can kind of see and hold it and make new meaning. That's where the integration process comes in, because sometimes the experience can be so intense that the meaning making doesn't necessarily happen fully in the experience. And that's where bringing that into that group process integration is so essential, because the people in recounting what happened in their experience are going to be feeling that implicitly, and the new information can actually come through the integration process with the group, with the facilitator.
Mm-hmm. And also, it seems as though large experiences, you're not going to have this one ayahuasca experience, for example, or this one, oh, I healed. And then however long it's been that this trauma has been implanted inside of you, that, okay, it's healed. You have the one group chat. Okay, you got it. And then for the rest of your life, that's just what it is. I mean, maybe, but for the most part, if you, especially with psychedelics and in my own experience, if you enter into an environment now where it's either implied or explicitly stated that you can't talk about these experiences, they can't come up, it omits them from who you are. And then all of a sudden, all that work that you did actually just reverts back and can even become worse, because now you have this progressed sense of losing your healing self. It's like you had achieved it. It was bad enough when it just hurt, but now you have to feel the hurt and the sense of having lost the achievement of no longer hurting, and why integration outside of even the specific group therapy back into your normal life is also really, really important.
Absolutely. And it's also important to highlight that a lot of this implicit developmental and attachment trauma shows up as shame. I shared at the Plant Spirit Medicine conference, my very first experience with ayahuasca. I was overwhelmed with this feeling of suffocation. It was very difficult, very heavy. And the whole time I was thinking, my God, I must be polluting the experience of everybody around me. And, with what I know now, I can look back and go, wow, shame was arising. And clearly what was being called up was implicit material from early childhood. And that shame was expressing itself in my conscious awareness. But at the time, I didn't have that trauma lens to be able to understand it as such. And what happens with shame is shame wants to hide. So when shame surfaces, people are going to very likely hold that in, not talk about it, isolate themselves, have thoughts like, my God, I shouldn't be doing this. Who was I to think I could even, engage in this? I'm terrible. I'm wrong. Shame says that there's something inherently wrong with me. And we get that idea implanted, that belief emerges in our childhood when the authenticity of our experience, so maybe we're feeling sad or angry, isn't held in relationship. There's nobody around us who's coming and saying, oh, how are you feeling? Validating that experience for us. Instead, we're alone in our room, or we're punished for having our experience. And what the child then begins to believe is, there's something wrong with me. That's the core belief of developmental trauma. And it emerges as shame. So when we understand this, and we can have these experiences and be like, oh, wow, shame is surfacing. There's movement here. There's some healing that's about to happen. And we can bring this into a holding space of integration, that shame can be given patience, can be given compassion, encouragement, understanding, all the things that the child needed and didn't get. And that's where we're giving new information again to the implicit.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're clearly talking right now about entheogenic experiences, but we're not at the same time, because it's so much beyond that, because the things that come up in an entheogenic experience, there's this misunderstanding from the era of rejection and ignorance that we're coming out of, thankfully, that these are all just hallucinations, right? And that hallucinations, originally, I think hallucination originally means to see or something, but we tend to see it as not being real. But part of my work is to encourage an understanding that whatever you come up and whatever the context is that you perceive these things coming up within a psychedelic experience, that's emotional honesty. The reason, the narrative, the story that tells you why those emotions are there, or the things that you're seeing that you perceive, because we're usually identified with looking outside of ourselves, perceiving the outside world and seeing it as the catalyst of what's happening inside of us. We perceive it as like, it's this story, but actually it's an expression of emotional honesty. And that the emotional honesty that comes up in a psychedelic experience, we can build this safe container around, oh, okay, this is why it's coming up. And I had that particular experience and it's expressing the shame and it goes back to this experience. And the ceremonies or whatever you might do to create a safe container for such a medicine journey works to say, okay, whatever comes up in here can be looked at as though, okay, what is that representing about something grander in myself? What emotions came up? You can really integrate it. But I think what should be really solidified here is that those emotions, anytime you feel those emotions coming up at any point in your life, is an opportunity to reflect on why they happened in the same way that they came up in a psychedelic experience. Anytime you are really triggered is usually because that stuff is already there and it's just being activated to the surface of your awareness. And that especially, I would say, in relationships wherein both or at least one party is very vulnerable, that these are moments when that stuff is coming up. So it can be seen and addressed and worked through.
Absolutely. You know, we really have to give ourselves permission to consider all our experiences as valid. And this is where mindfulness comes in, where we can begin to identify the judging mind that's operating on habit-driven, conditioned patterns of thinking, of judging right or wrong or real or not real, and look at every experience as valid and giving it our unconditional attention. So yes, you have some type of emotional experience come up in your daily life, maybe something that you recall surfacing in an entheogenic experience that you had some insight around. And we can pause, pausing, sati, mindfulness, right? This capacity to pause, to take stock of what's actually happening in the body mind. So physically in the body, we know that the emotions are actually registered in the insula, which is the part of the brain that registers our felt experience, our embodied felt experience. So take stock of what is happening in felt perception right now. And give ourselves permission also to drop the storyline. So as you say, the circumstances that might have triggered this felt experience to emerge in our present moment experience, to feel it fully, rather than pushing it down, and to not necessarily begin jumping to conclusions about, blaming others or blaming the circumstances for creating it, but actually having this attitude of mindfulness, which is a beginner's mind, this attitude of curiosity and investigation, which is the second factor of awakening after mindfulness, is investigating our experience with non-judgment. And that gives these felt experiences space to actually be felt and to, in being felt, be metabolized often, right? And then if we can really just give value to our authentic experience. Often what happened when we're young is we traded our authentic experience in order to have attachment with our caregivers. Mm-hmm. So it's giving back to ourselves this value and this inherent dignity and okayness with just being as we are 100% fully.
Mm-hmm. I deeply believe that when we really surrender to what's real in ourselves, not in the sense of like letting, I don't want to put too many conditions. When we are unconditionally present to what's happening in the felt experience of the body, and we can manage to just let that do its thing, it will naturally realign itself. Like that's Absolutely. The healing. And,
it is. Yeah.
And I also, I believe that we, these implicit imprints that happen way before we have the capacity to form explicit memory, they are like the template through which we experience any related experience later in life. I like the metaphor that if you were to change the channel, if you're watching TV, this is like your reality, and you go through different channels, it's like different thought patterns and different contextual environments, right? Wherein the limbic system is like going into the back end, or the implicit memories are like going into the back end and turning up the green hue all the way. and that you go and you're still just going through the channels and going through the different thought processes and whatever, but it's all different now because that green hue is always present. So what happens really, really early on in life is it becomes the template for how you experience that later in life. And if it's traumatic, then we can see that the trauma comes up over and over again. It gets triggered and it comes to the surface. And when we're not mindful of it, I personally believe that we will inflict it upon others. We'll accidentally create an environment wherein we find and surround people around us, or surround us with people who will trigger that in ourselves in a way because we're able to trigger them, so that it all comes to the surface. And it seems really malevolent, like we're all just trying to hurt each other. But I deeply believe that we're all just trying to bring it back up so we can hold a space for it. Because if we can bring it up and hold a proper space for it, it'll resolve itself just in presence and love within the self primarily. And then that within the self love and acknowledgement echoed out through the other people in our communities who are doing the same thing. And we can build these really healthy, functional things. I see the conscious relationship as much a spiritual practice over the long term as any entheogenic experience could ever offer you, because it's always also holding you accountable to another person who you care for and who cares for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you touch on really two key things there. One is that we must remember that the natural inclination of life, of the human organism, is towards healing. You know, you cut yourself, you look at that, there's this natural intelligence there that just knits the skin back together, you know, and that's happening on all levels of our being, our emotional being, you know, mental, body. So we can trust that. And often when there's these natural healing images that emerge as we're doing the deep healing work, as trauma imprints are having resolution, whether that's seeing beautiful butterflies, you know, flying out of your abdomen, or whether it's feeling like a little baby being held in the loving arms of some kind of cosmic or universal mother. You know, there's the natural inclination of the organism is towards healing, and we can trust that, and we can trust that in each other. So as a healthcare provider, as I see my clients, my patients, I'm holding them and seeing that in them. You know, I'm certainly not seeing them as broken, in need of fixing. It's really just holding space for them and their natural healing capacity to and helping to create the conditions for that to emerge on its own. And the other thing you spoke about was sacred partnership, healthy relationships, as important as you said, any entheogenic experience. And I would really echo that, because we're wounded in relationship. We're born into a world, and by default, we are relational beings, and our wounding happens relationally, and therefore the healing needs to happen relationally. And the rewiring or the wiring of those circuits in the brain that maybe weren't laid down well because there wasn't a positive holding environment in our early years, that happens through healthy relationship. And we can reparent ourselves, and we can do a lot of work, for example, through mindfulness. And Dan Siegel talks a lot about this in interpersonal neurobiology, about how when we practice mindfulness, we can actually be present to ourselves, present to those younger parts of ourselves. And that's wonderful, and that's really important. And even more so when we can be present with another who's holding us in their unconditional positive regard. That's wiring up all of those relational circuits. You know, we're wired for connection. We have mirror neurons in our brains. We have places in our brain designated for facial recognition, for understanding all these nuances of communication, for meeting this exquisite other. And that is so integral to our healing on an individual level, in relationship, and then that translates out into our sangha, our community, and then further out into the world.
So we're running to the end of this interview, and I believe that we've actually approached and from a side angle, you know, roundabout all the three pillars that that you mentioned at the beginning of the interview. Could you go into what these three pillars are, which you kind of mentioned at the beginning, but now as referred to what we've been talking about throughout the course of the hour?
Sure. So the first pillar is mindfulness, which is applicable to the mindset you bring to an experience. Mindfulness allows us to learn to stay present to our experience, to the felt perception, the embodied felt perception of our experience. It also allows us to be conscious of our judging mind and our habit-driven thought patterns so that we don't necessarily need to believe them or to believe the story that our mind is producing reactively. And another thing mindfulness really brings is this quality of equanimity, to be able to be present with intense experiences without needing to push them away, run from them, or grasp for experiences. So that really plays into everything we've been talking about, this capacity to be with our experience compassionately, to have these implicit imprints come up and to be able to stay with it, allow new information to integrate. And so the second pillar is this trauma-informed approach, which is really understanding what trauma is, how it's stored in the nervous system, how we have these fight or flight and freeze responses that can be thwarted and that actually want completion and resolution. So that can happen very somatically through the body, as well as the nature of implicit memory and implicit imprinting in trauma. And also just really having consideration for how common this is. It's almost ubiquitous that there's some type of attachment trauma or wounding, and it might be subtle for some and it might be really devastating for others, but really holding space for ourselves, that there are parts that we can really bring in and offer to ourselves so that we can remember our wholeness as human beings. And then the third pillar is the importance of group process integration, facilitated integration, so that this holding space, this inquiring can continue, so that we can really anchor the meaning that emerges from our emotional and felt sense experiences. I really like how Stephen Buhner, who's an author, has written prolifically. He talks about actually how to communicate with plants. And he says, first feel the feeling, the emotion and the feeling in the body that emerges from that. And then from there, meaning emerges. So it's sort of like this bottom-up process. So this group facilitation and investigation process can really help us to flush up the meaning for ourselves and for that to be witnessed by others, so that we really feel seen and held in that, and we can reclaim ourselves in a new way, and be seen in that and held in that compassionately, which is such a potent thing for healing and a really, really important piece in this work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this last piece you offered in regards to Buhner's work and being present to understanding and harvesting the meaning of things that are happening around you by being able to surrender yourself into the immediacy of felt perception is a really, really beautiful piece. Now, before we end the interview, I'd like to ask you, for people who are getting this kind of information for the first time and you just blew their worlds open, and they're, for example, when I saw Gabor talk at this conference just recently, he said things that made such deep sense to me that I just started crying, because it felt like it was the first time I had ever been fully acknowledged in my life. And he wasn't even looking at me, So I feel really like there's a lot of that type of resonant information in this. And for someone who may be coming up to this interview and saying, wow, that just sinks in for the first time, what would be the first 2 steps you would give to people who are just opening up to this whole area of understanding in regards to addressing their trauma and moving towards a more integrated life?
The first 2 steps, like practical steps?
Yeah, the first 2 is this one, and then once then. Okay,
so first, pause. Pause and really feel and acknowledge what's arising in you right now, the felt experience of that, the goodness in you that is recognizing whatever is wholesome, and really hold space for that, acknowledge and anchor and ground that, because that's a resource. And in holding space for that, then the next step would be to begin to intend to reach out to find others who are resonant with this, which is resonant in you, and begin to investigate and look for information. So be that through finding, connecting with you or me. I'm certainly open to people connecting with me. By email, they can go to my website, drdevonchristie.com, and I'm happy to also point people in directions that can be of service to their journey. But yeah, I think it's the next step once you've acknowledged it and really taken stock is to begin to find the resources that are going to continue to support you in what's resonating as true in your being. Because really, ultimately, there is only one truth, and that is your own subjective truth. Nobody else can tell you what is real, what isn't real, what's right, what's wrong. You are the master of that. That is something that is so precious in this human experience to acknowledge and really hold space for. And so use that as your barometer, get in touch with that and then find the resources around you that seem to be brightening and amplifying that place in you that is recognizing truth. So that might have been a bit of an abstract answer, but that would be my recommendations.
No, it felt good. It feels like learning how to see, acknowledge, and follow your inner compass once you get yourself out of erratic magnetic fields of trauma and weird people and manipulations and self-expectation and other expectation. And because this certainly, I think that throughout the course of this, we talk very easily about it, and interested, we both are quite interested about the topic, but it is to be known that it's not an easy journey to go on. And that for anyone who's listening now, that feels inspired, and then by the end of the day or by the end of the week, you feel like you've just fallen right back to all of it again. You haven't lost anything in this process. It's a lifelong journey, and it's not so easy as just making the switch, and to have compassion for yourself in the process.
Absolutely, James. I share with you this understanding of the path of the wounded healer, and I spoke about that in my talk. I really feel that all of us are wounded healers in some way or another. And we may be explicitly enacting that in some type of healing profession, but everybody has a unique medicine to offer this world that is so desperately needed. And that gift comes from our wounds. Rumi says, keep your eye on the bandaged place. That is where the light enters you. So be really this compassionate turning towards ourselves. And yeah, we're going to trip and we're going to feel sick again and all of that. But, it's carrying on, we're all wayfarers. And when we connect with each other in that, it really brings support. So yeah, I really honor everything that you're doing to bring this type of information to all of your listeners.
Thank you, Devon. I reflect the same sentiments towards you. And on that note, I want to thank you very much for coming on ATTMind Radio, and ask if there's any other contact information or website URLs that you want to offer to the audience before we end the interview.
Yeah, so I mentioned drdevonchristie.com, and this website is still somewhat under construction, so my apologies if it looks in any way glitchy, but so I can be contacted through the website. Also on Facebook, I have a profile. It's Dr. Devon Christie MD, so you can contact me through Facebook, and I'll look forward to connecting with anyone who feels called to connect.
Great. And to all the listeners out there, thank you for yet again participating in another episode of ATTMind Radio. If you like what you heard, please head over to iTunes and leave us a comment and review. And if you are really interested in supporting the podcast, I've recently started a Patreon page, which you can check out through my website, jameswjesso.com. And until the next episode, take care and be easy with yourself. Bye.
Hey everyone, James here. This podcast and all of my writing is a passion project and brought to you by, you. If you believe in the value of what I'm offering, there's a few ways to support, such as following me on social media like Twitter or YouTube, or even just by telling a friend. Word of mouth goes a long way. If you really like what I'm offering and want to bring your support to the next level, please consider donating to the podcast via PayPal or Patreon, or you could buy a copy of one of my books. Head over to jameswjesso.com/support to find out more details. And thanks. If it wasn't for you, I couldn't do what I do.